Good evening, everybody. Hello, how are you all? Thank you all for coming here to the inaugural symposium, UN 2013 Grand Rapids, a symposium devoted to commemorating the founding of the UN. I'm going to ask you to please turn your cell phones off and to also note that a few things are happening at the back of this room here. One of them is this. There are applications to the United Nations Association available in the back, and the price for students is, as Professor St. Clair has indicated to me, despite what the application says, free. Yes, a student can belong to the United Nations Association for the price of $0, which I think is a pretty good deal. He's nodding his head. He says, yeah, it's one hell of a deal. I'm also going to ask you to please consider looking at the African Wildlife Calendar and the T-shirts that are available as fundraising materials for CAMFED, the Campaign for Female Education in Africa. The International Geographical Honor Society Honors Chapter at GRCC has for 4 years devoted monies to CAMFED, engaged in the raising of funds for facilitating the education of girls and women in the continent of Africa. And it's been pretty effective. So far, I believe we have raised enough money to fund the education of 20 girls, which is a pretty good thing. As we know, the education of girls can facilitate prosperity as well as stability in a society that's characterized by people living on the margins and living a life of violence. Regardless, tonight, as our keynote speaker, we have Professor Yael Aronoff from the James Madison College at Michigan State University. Professor Aronoff has studied quite a bit with regard to peacekeeping in the Middle East, particularly vis-a-vis the Palestinians and Israelis. In fact, she is expecting to have her most recent book published titled, Israeli Hardliners Opt for Peace, The Political Psychology of Prime Ministers. It's expected to be available by Cambridge University Press in the spring of 2014. I should probably also mention that although I've known Professor Aronoff for probably 4 or 5 years, she's not known me. I just met her today, maybe about 12:30 this afternoon, and we took part in an interview as part of the Conversation with a Geographer series. I've known Professor Aronoff because she was my daughter's favorite professor when my daughter was enrolled at the James Madison College, and she found her to be particularly enlightening. And I can tell you that she indeed is, and very devoted, having received teaching awards and has had a very good record of her commitment to students as well as her scholarship. So, without further ado, I will ask you to please greet Professor Yael Aronoff.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your warm welcome. It's great to see such a large audience on a weekday evening, and it's been a pleasure to be here today. I wanted to thank Mike DeVivo for inviting me. His daughter Amelia was a fantastic, very bright, compassionate student, and it was a pleasure to have her and meet her dad as well. And thank you for hosting me and for the United Nations Association support as well. It's really been a pleasure. I was privy to the previous lecture today, and the panel was very intellectually stimulating and engaging day, and I was happy to be able to share it with you. So I look forward to your comments and to discussion after the talk. In terms of relation to the UN, there's so much focus today legitimately on Syria, given the humanitarian tragedy there. And when we reflect upon the UN Security Council today, we're at a point where for so many years after the Soviet Union disintegrated, you had this explosion of peacekeeping forces by the UN because you no longer had the Soviet Union vetoing one thing or another in the context of the Cold War. So there was a lot more cooperation. Of course, today with Syria, we see kind of differences of opinion between the US and Russia and others that make kind of a concerted and united UN effort for humanitarian relief in Syria more difficult, although of course we all are aware of the really good work that the UN inspectors are doing in trying to locate and destroy chemical weapons in Syria. But that I was going to kind of refer to the UN's work in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That won't be the emphasis, the UN's role, focus of my talk, but I certainly wanted to begin with the role that the UN has played a very positive role in trying to support the negotiations that have been taking place on and off between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization and then the Palestinian Authority over the last 20 years. And certainly as part of the quartet of the UN, Russia, the EU, and the US have all been behind kind of backing these negotiations and have been for really legitimizing a two-state solution in terms of a peace agreement as something that largely the many members and the UN itself and Secretary Generals have repeatedly backed over many years, in addition to our own government and that of the Arab League since 2002 with the Saudi peace plan, which is a dramatic move on the part of many, many Arab states stating that if Israel were going to go back to the 67 borders and there was a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as the capital and a just and agreed upon solution to the Palestinian refugees, then there would be kind of peace throughout the region and normalization of relations with Israel. So in that sense, the UN has played a very important role in helping push the parties towards peace negotiations and supporting those negotiations and really legitimizing and pushing the whole framework for a solution to this 100-year-old conflict, and has played a very positive role in that respect. A lot of people, for the first time, as many of you know, in 3 years, there are now, again, serious peace negotiations taking place between Israel and the Palestinian Authority that are being mediated by Secretary of State Kerry, as well as Martin Indyke and others in the American administration. So it's really a sign of, I think, great hope for the possibilities of solving this conflict. Yet you have a lot of people who are quite pessimistic. Both, many Palestinians, many Israelis are quite pessimistic that these negotiations are going to succeed. You have a lot of policymakers and pundits and scholars all across the world who are extremely pessimistic as well that we're going to succeed in getting a successful negotiation within an agreement within 7 months, which is what Secretary of State Kerry had, which is his goal, to really try to resolve this once and for all within 7 months. So in this environment of kind of great pessimism, I'm going to try to show you some possibilities here and explain to you why I think it is possible, not necessarily probable, but possible that we could find an agreement. And one of the reasons that I'm going to go through with you is how close both parties have come in the past 20 years of negotiations to really providing a possible solution for the conflict. So substantively, many people know what an agreement will look like, and it's been a variety of reasons, a kind of domestic constraints among both Palestinians and Israelis, sometimes lack of political will and leadership, sometimes that they're not having the will exactly simultaneously and they're missing chances, and they're all and spoilers on both sides to the peace process that can contribute to why we don't have an agreement today. But I'll walk you through kind of the progress that has been made to kind of show you or suggest to you that actually the parties are substantively very close indeed to figuring out what an agreement would look like, and that the US really has played a constructive role in trying to put a framework for the solution, as we'll see in the Clinton parameters. In addition to that, I come from kind of the field of international relations and political science, and so one school of thought really talks a lot about balance of power in the regions and things like that. And in terms of those things, I think there's a lot of room for hope as well, that in terms of the balance of power in the region, there are a lot of things pushing for a solution as well, despite people's pessimism. So one thing that's happening, as you're probably aware of, is you see an increasing partnership between the US, a lot of Sunni moderate states in the region, and Israel more and more. And what they see is balancing against a competitor for power in the region, which is Iran, and some of its supporters, which is the Assad regime and Hezbollah in Lebanon and so forth. And there's a real kind of rivalry and competition going on for years. And you could see that if any of you picked up on the WikiLeaks that came out, I think it was a couple years ago now, you had all these leaders of Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates really voicing their deep concerns and fears in terms of growing Iranian power in the region. And often you'd have these dramatic statements as well coming from some of these states that the head of the snake should be cut off and the US should do something, et cetera, which were quite dramatic and were said in private and wouldn't be said in public. And even today in Syria, you see these kinds of things, of course, playing out, where you have Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and to some degree Turkey, and the US to some extent, supporting in concert some of the rebel forces in Syria today, the Free Syria Army and others, against kind of Iran and Hezbollah's and Russia's propping up of the Assad regime, partially because of this competition for balance of power in the region. Within this balance as well, many of you know that Hamas, which is now controlling the Gaza Strip since the summer of 2007, also has gotten support in the past from Iran, not to nearly the same extent as Hezbollah. But it is in a weaker position today, a couple years into the Arab Spring, and upheavals coming across the region. And it rejects a two-state solution. And so in that sense, it has essentially lost the support of the Assad regime because it became more critical of how brutal Assad has been in Syria. So some of its leaders have had to leave Syria. Of course, now with the some would call it a coup in Egypt as well, where now the Muslim Brotherhood is out of power, at least temporarily in Egypt. It's lost that support and substitute from Egypt. And it's lost some support for Iran from its criticism of Syria and so forth. So it's right now is in a much weakened position as well, which on one hand could strengthen Fatah and those forces in Palestine that for a two-state solution. So you have some things going on domestically that are a product of the events in the region over the past 2 years that could support kind of the probability of successful negotiations happening. And likewise on the Israeli side, although you certainly don't have the ideal government, I don't think, and I certainly can get into it at some point, for successful peace negotiations, in comparison to the last government, it has moved to a much greater extent to the center in the elections that took place a few months ago. And you have Tzipi Livni, who's the head of a center party, who's heading the Israeli negotiating team, who generally is pushing for a successful peace treaty and had a lot of success in 2008 when she was negotiating under Prime Minister Ehud Olmert with Abu Mazen. So you have some things happening in the region in terms of a common effort to balance a power against Iran. You have some things happening domestically on the part of Palestinians and Israelis. I think that all make it to some extent conducive environment to at least having the possibility of an agreement. And of course, there are a lot of obstacles that we could get into as well, but a lot of people stress the obstacles, so I'm trying to put forward some optimistic scenarios as well. But I'll focus in this lecture today on the series of negotiations that have happened thus far and the progress that's been made to kind of set out for you what the likely solution will be, whether we're lucky enough, in my mind, to have it within the next 7 months, or whether it's going to be 7 years or unfortunately longer. I think the framework for a solution certainly has been there throughout the negotiating process. So as many of you know, Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization basically would not even recognize each other before 1993, right? So that the PLO earlier said, we don't want Israel to be there at all. We want Palestine to include all of that territory, and we don't support a two-state solution, right? Certainly before their official change in 1988. Their 1988 proclamation. And on the Israeli side, in 1993, it was actually illegal, right, to negotiate with an official of the PLO because they had been considered as an organization that seeks the destruction of Israel and is willing to use terror tactics, right? So both sides, in a sense, often throughout the years kind of negated the right to self-determination of the other, negated kind of the national narratives of the other, and actually made it illegal, or that actually sometimes people would be assassinated if they engage in negotiations before 1993. And there are a series of things that I'll just very briefly go over that led to kind of the ability of the parties to recognize one another for the first time officially and break a huge taboo in doing that in Oslo, Norway in 1993. And on the Palestinian side, there are several things that brought a dramatic change on the part of the PLO. And part of that was the fact that they had the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and they lost support from the former Soviet Union. Part of it was that Yasser Arafat had sided with Saddam Hussein during the first Gulf War, and therefore lost $150 million a year from the Gulf states, who were angry at him for supporting Saddam Hussein. And part of it was the first Palestinian intifada, or uprising, that started in 1986 to 1993, in which the Palestinian leadership on the West Bank and Gaza actually started the intifada rather than Yasser Arafat and the leadership that had been in exile in Tunis and Tunisia. And they were much more willing to have a state alongside Israel rather than instead of Israel. And they led to those changes. In addition, also to US pressures of not officially negotiating with the PLO until they changed their ultimate goal and some of their tactics. So that led to a pretty dramatic change on the part of the PLO that some people argue started in the 70s, but didn't actually articulate itself in terms of official policy till 1988 and then in 1993. On the Israeli side, there are a lot of changes going on as well that led to the recognition of the PLO. And one such change was the impact that the first Palestinian uprising, or intifada, had on Israelis. They saw that the status quo, many Israelis, not all Israelis, saw that the status quo was unsustainable, that the occupation was leading to a lot of suffering on the part of Palestinians, and that it really was a national movement in which so many people were participating in often nonviolent demonstrations and so forth. And that had a big impact on Israel. And ultimately, when force was used by then Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin to put down the intifada, and that force was unsuccessful, leading him to try to turn to a political solution. Another thing that influenced him as he saw growing at that time Iranian power, Iraqi power, he saw those states as being a greater threat to Israel than surrounding states in its immediate area, and thought that Israel should make peace with its surrounding neighbors in order to be able to face greater dangers, right? So those were a combination of factors, and there are many, many others, that led both parties over time to become more accommodating to one another, at least to agree to talk to one another officially in Oslo I. Now, many people at that time in both Israel and Palestine viewed Oslo as a peace agreement, and their expectations were so high. Most Israelis were euphoric. Most Palestinians were euphoric in the sense that many Palestinians thought a Palestinian state in 1993 was right around the corner, and many Israelis thought that peace and security were right around the corner. And so the expectations were very high, and of course, events since then really diminished them greatly, right? To the point where a lot of people argue that Oslo is dead at this point, right? But what was Oslo about? Oslo was not a peace agreement itself, but rather it was a peace process, right? And it was supposed to be a kind of slow transitional process that would allow both parties, after years of conflict and violence, to actually trust one another to a greater extent. And the feeling was that if trust was built by Israel on one hand having gradual withdrawals from the occupied Palestinian territories in the West Bank and Gaza on one hand, and having the Palestinian Authority try to really cut down on terrorist tactics, especially by Hamas at that time, as well as incitement to terror and so forth, that if both, and there were many other obligations, but those were some of the main obligations, that if both parties did these things, they could establish sufficient trust after so many years of conflict that would then enable them to address the main issues that need to be addressed in order to reach a successful agreement, right? So one of them is where the border exactly is going to be, right, if you're going to have two states. Another one is, what are you going to do with Jerusalem, right? Israel in 1967 took over East Jerusalem. Many people in Israel got very used to and very happy with having all of East Jerusalem, because before 1967, there was a Jewish quarter that is part of the Old City where their main holy site and historical site is. The remains of the supporting wall to their old temple that had been destroyed 2,000 years previously. And when, before 67, it was under Jordanian rule, Jordan destroyed the Jewish quarter and wouldn't allow any Jews living anywhere to go pray there. So they were pretty euphoric in getting Jerusalem and were very reluctant, right, to, in their eyes, redivide it or concede parts of Jerusalem, again, for fears of what might happen in the future. And of course, on the Palestinian side, as many of you know, they are deeply tied in terms of their own national narrative and national identity to Al-Quds, or Jerusalem, being their capital. The third holiest Muslim sites in the world are on the same place, on the Temple Mount. I know I have several geologists in the audience, right? But if you look at just the rivalry over holy sites and where they physically are in Israel, it's crazy that they're almost exact same place, right? So basically, if you look at this table, one could look at that as what Jewish Israelis call, it's like the size of several football fields, what many Jewish Israelis call the Temple Mount, or where their old temple used to stand, right? And for Muslims, it's where they have this beautiful mosque, two mosques, one with the golden dome that you often see in pictures of Jerusalem, which is the third holiest site, where Muhammad, when he went up to heaven, was supposed to have gone up from that same spot that's on what they called Haram Sharif, what Jewish Israelis call Temple Mount. So it's the exact same spot. If you look at this wall, you could see that as the Western Wall, or the supporting wall where Jews now pray, that the wall that used to support the temple. And the Muslim Waqf has religious jurisdiction over the top where the mosques are. But you can see how physically they're connected, and that leads to real discussion, is what happens to Jerusalem if Palestinians want it to be their capital and Israel wants it to be their capital. And I'll look at what previous proposals have done about this, right? So that's a second issue. A third issue is Palestinian refugees, right, from 1948 and from 1967. Palestinian Authority and the PLO has always wanted a right of return for those refugees. Israel is very fearful of having many refugees return, because it thinks that the whole reason that Israel was created was to get one country in the world where there'd be self-determination for Jews. The only way you have self-determination is by having a majority in a state. And if you risk eventually in 50 years of more and more Palestinians return to Israel, and you had the demographics change, so now Jewish Israelis are 75 to 80% of pre-1967 Israel, they fear that they would no longer be a majority, and therefore they wouldn't have self-determination, and they might as well not have Israel at all. They could live anywhere else, right? So you have both real strong feelings concerning refugee issues and how to handle those refugee issues. And then you have security issues, right? Well, how can you, once you have two states, assure that both peoples will live in security and won't be attacked from one another anymore, right? So, and there are other issues like water. But those are the four main issues. And then the Oslo process said, look, these are such difficult issues, and they're so emotionally laden, and they're so tied to each people's national identity, that let's first build trust on the ground before we talk about these issues. And arguably, for the first couple of years, from 1993 to 95, that was pretty successful, actually. That Israel did, at that point before 1996, withdraw, not always completely on time, sometimes 2 months delay, sometimes 3 months delay, but more or less it withdrew from Palestinian cities, right? So not from most of the West Bank, but from pretty much all the cities, right, where people are actually living. So that's what Israel did to try to fulfill its end of confidence-building measures that would build trust. And Yasser Arafat, who headed the Palestinian Authority at that time, also was trying to do a lot to clamp down on terror tactics used by Hamas, because before Oslo was signed and right after Oslo was signed, it intentionally had a lot of suicide bombings within Israel with the intent of stopping the peace process, undermining the peace process, since they opposed the two-state solution, right? So one thing to keep in mind is about 70% of each population over the past 20 years, something 65% to 70%, even through periods of cycles of violence, have been willing to accept a two-state solution in order to get peace. They don't always completely agree on what those two states would look like, but they more or less agree. And you had 30% of each population which opposed the idea for their own reasons, basically did not want to compromise and thought it was an injustice to compromise national identity and goals and so forth, right? So Hamas represented some of this 30%, and they wanted to destroy the peace process. And so the people in Israel on the right who opposed the process to begin with, because they want to keep land for historical reasons or religious reasons, etc., would say, oh, we have the Oslo peace process, but there's no peace, because actually more Israelis are being killed now than before the Oslo Accords were signed, right? And so that's what the right would say. And Palestinians would say, well, settlements are continued to be built by Israel on Palestinian land that is supposed to become a Palestinian state, so this is undermining our trust, right? So those things were happening, but as a whole, in the first 2 or 3 years, largely trust was being built in the sense that Arafat really was trying to jail Hamas people who were planning suicide bombings. He was trying to clamp down on it. Rabin's trust of him was growing as a peace partner. Israel was making these withdrawals. And arguably, you had two leaders at that time who may have been genuinely interested in reaching an agreement and building trust. So that, you had this kind of time of hope, I think, in the first 2 or 3 years. But what then undermined it and unraveled it was, and this is what people look at it when they look back today, they think maybe we don't need kind of this delayed, long, staged process to build trust, because in fact, the opposite could happen, and the opposite started happening, in a sense that the longer something is dragged out before you get to the main issues, the more time the opposition which exists on both sides can mobilize to try to oppose it and destroy it. And that's what eventually led to an undermining of trust eventually, rather than a building of trust. And one of the factors that led up to that was, of course, the assassination of Rabin by a young religious fanatic, I don't know, that's not a neutral term, but I'll use it, Jewish Israeli who thought that Rabin was a traitor in his willingness to withdraw from large parts of the West Bank, which he was tied to for religious reasons, right? And so he assassinated Rabin. Rabin was on a stage such as this at a peace rally trying to get support for the peace process. There were thousands of people in the audience. He was this kind of terse military man of very few words, but he was trying to mouth these words to this peace song that was being sung. And he was assassinated. And this was a huge blow to the peace process, because here you had a leader that Israelis trusted in terms of his security credentials as being a past Israel Defense Forces chief of staff, and he was assassinated. And then in the aftermath of that, you had increased suicide bombings, and then the following election, Benjamin Netanyahu, who was Israel's prime minister today, was very, very, very narrowly elected. His rival was Shimon Peres, who was already celebrating his victory when, it was very few votes that made the difference. And he was elected because of security fears. And you can see, that's not to legitimate it, but you can see in every country when you have attacks or suicide bombings, and as we could see with our own country, it's no surprise then sometimes what party actually gets elected. And it's usually when there are attacks, a party on the right that is more likely to be elected. And so there's a cycle. And this prime minister was less genuinely invested in getting to a successful agreement, given his own very different political ideology from that of Prime Minister Rabin, right? So you had Yitzhak Rabin came from the Labor Party ideology that was increasingly thinking the time was working against Israel, that was increasingly talking about the urgency of reaching a peace agreement, and that cared really only about security and thought that if Israel could be secure in a two-state agreement, that would be enough. But they didn't have, in their own ideology, these historical ties to the West Bank, or what religious Israelis call Judea and Samaria. Whereas Benjamin Netanyahu, who's today's prime minister, comes from the Likud party, that did have those ideological ties to the land that would be conceded for a Palestinian state, right? So they would claim that a lot of the second, holiest Jewish city after Jerusalem is Hebron, which is in the West Bank, and all the forefathers and foremothers mentioned in the Bible are buried in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. And some, for religious reasons, the Likud party, for historical reasons, thought, oh, there used to be an Israel sovereign state in this territory, and we need to replicate that. And so he ideologically was much more reluctant to concede land than was Yitzhak Rabin. And he was also concerned about the security environment, and he ended up delaying to much greater extent the further Israeli withdrawals, and arguably not fulfilling all his obligations in the Oslo process by not fully withdrawing from all the land that he had supposed to. And his rationale was, well, it's kind of like this tit for tat, almost it's a very serious conflict, not to minimize it or trivialize it, but almost something you'd see with kids. Well, I'm not going to do something until the other does it, right? And so both sides were in this game where I'm not going to fulfill my commitments to Oslo until you do, right? And so Netanyahu said, well, I'm going to stop with further withdrawals until Yasser Arafat actually clamps down on Hamas terror, and he doesn't let them out of jail, and he actually fulfills his end of the bargain. And then Arafat trusted Netanyahu less than he did Rabin in return, and said, well, why should I do all my obligations if you're not fulfilling your withdrawal? So in effect, each side started saying, I'm not fully obligated anymore to do everything that was expected of me from the Oslo process because you're not fulfilling your end of the bargain, right? And there was no kind of enforcement mechanism at that point to actually get both parties, who I think increasingly after the Rabin assassination were both violating their commitments to Oslo. There was nothing, no enforcement to actually make the change, and trust was increasingly undermined, right? And this is one of the things that led, in some people's mind, to the death of Oslo. I don't think Oslo is dead, because Oslo created the legitimacy in the world, and I was talking about by the UN and the UN Secretary General as part of the quartet, in trying to support the framework for a two-state solution. And it established kind of the institutions of a Palestinian state. Oslo too did. It basically allowed the leadership to come back into the Palestinian territories, to hold elections, to have an executive, legislative, and judicial branch of government, and to essentially establish the state institutions, right, that are the precursor to building a state. And certainly institutionally, and in terms of world legitimacy, something was built there that would be very hard, I think, to retract in terms of the momentum for, legitimacy for, and institutions for a Palestinian state. That being said, things deteriorated on the ground until Ehud Barak was elected in 2000. And he was, again, from the Labor Party. He was elected under a platform for peace, a campaign for peace. He said, I'm going to get to a solution with the Palestinians within 2 years. He was kind of Yitzhak Rabin's protege, and he said, I'm going to carry the mantle of the former Yitzhak Rabin and actually genuinely bring a peace agreement. And I think his heart was in the right place. He made a lot of mistakes, and I'll have time to talk about a few of them. But he was elected upon the platform of reaching an agreement, and I think he had the intention to reach an agreement. So what happened along the way? And there's several things that happened. One is he first turned to Syria, as Yitzhak Rabin had done and several others, to make peace with Syria first under Assad. The President Assad's father, when he was ill, had an increased interest in making peace with Israel so that his son wouldn't have to deal with these issues, because his son would have less legitimacy in Syria than he had. And he made some overtures to Israel. There were some serious negotiations, and there are a variety of things that if you want to hear more about in the question and answer period, I can elaborate on. But one of the hesitations Barak had was domestic political opinion. Will I be able to make concessions on the Syrian front and the Palestinian front at the same time? Will I be reelected if I do so? And he started getting cold feet. But from Yasser Arafat's position, that led him to really distrust Barak, because he thought he's kind of neglecting the Palestinian front. He's spending his time and energies on the Syrian front and trying to reach peace with Syria, and that Arafat saw as an insult to him. Second thing that happened was a kind of very different visions of where to go from here in terms of the peace agreement, right? So Barak thought, look, Oslo has unraveled, and what we need to do is just have a summit where we actually talk about Jerusalem refugees, security, and borders, and we just get to an agreement and sign it, and don't worry about building the trust on the ground, because that's not working, right? But in doing so, he thought, well, that means that I don't have to bother the little implementations of Oslo along the way. So he thought when there was a little withdrawal Israel had to do, he said, well, I don't have to bother doing it because I'm looking at the big picture and I'm trying to get out of the vast majority of the territory. I don't have to worry about this little place. But for Arafat, the way he saw it is, well, if Barak's serious, why isn't he fulfilling still his interim Oslo obligations? And it again undermined trust. Right? And at Camp David itself, Clinton was very involved, and the sides did make some progress. So for the first time ever, Israel, and under Ehud Barak, said, I'm willing to concede much of East Jerusalem, most of East Jerusalem, so that the Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem will become part of Palestine, and half to 2/3 of the old city, which is about a kilometer where all the religious sites are for Christians, Jews, and Muslims, will be divided essentially, so that the Christian and Muslim quarters, whose residents are largely Palestinian, will go to the new Palestinian state. The Jewish quarter will stay in Israel, and the political sovereignty will be divided within Jerusalem. So there was a lot of concessions that were made, but they, again, had very different visions of what they saw from a negotiating process. So Barak thought, in his arrogance, because supposedly he has a very brilliant IQ that is very high, and I could go into that, but he has very low emotional intelligence, or kind of doesn't put a lot of emphasis on interpersonal relationships, on understanding, on building trust, or anything like that. He just doesn't think that's important. He thinks you're there to fulfill your national interests, whether someone likes you or doesn't like you. If you have coffee with them, you spend more time with them, is immaterial, right? This is where he's coming from. And he also thought, well, I'm the first Israeli prime minister to fluently speak Arabic. I know how to negotiate kind of in a market. And what you do is you first start off low, and then you keep, conceding more and more, and that will make Arafat feel good. So even though he was willing to concede about 95% of the West Bank, he started off with 76%, and then went up to 80%, went up to 85%, ultimately to 92% at that particular summit. But Arafat it had the opposite effect on Arafat. He got insulted. He thought, we're already, in Arafat's point of view, made the big compromise in being willing to live alongside Israel. Because if we're living alongside Israel, we only have 23% of the original Palestine mandate, which means we have already made the big concession. We've already made the big compromise, right? And here he's now haggling with me over 76% of my little 23%, which infuriated him and backfired, right? On the other hand, Clinton and Barack were expecting Arafat to also make some proposals, make some concessions, make some compromises. And he kept saying no to the Israeli proposals. Indeed, it seemed to be working, perhaps, because he kept saying no, and then Barack would be willing to concede more. But that infuriated Barack and Clinton. So they thought it's fine if you don't like this proposal, but you're not coming up with your own proposal, and you don't seem to be making any concessions. So that infuriated them. And when Clinton had promised both parties at Camp David that he would not put the blame on either party for if they couldn't reach an agreement, and afterwards Clinton actually did put the blame publicly on Arafat. And as did Barack. So what did it do in terms of the dynamics of the conflict? It had a negative effect. Not only did it undermine kind of trust on the part of the Palestinian leadership of the American mediators, but it also convinced the Israelis that there's no partner for peace, right? Because here, the Israelis loved Clinton, much more so even than in America, right? If you remember, Clinton had come to Rabin's funeral. He had said, Shalom Chaver, goodbye, friend. Every single bumper sticker and every single Israeli car practically had the Shalom Chaver of Clinton. They adored Clinton. And here is Clinton himself, the god, saying it's Arafat's fault, as well as their own prime minister. So Israelis thought, hey, our prime minister is willing to concede most of East Jerusalem. He was willing to concede most, 92% with swaps of the West Bank, and Arafat said no, and therefore Arafat is not a real partner. He doesn't really want to have a two-state solution, etc. What happened then in Israeli politics? Well, if Barack says there's no partner and Clinton says there's no partner, they again voted for the right in Israel, because then there's no point, right, in voting for the left or the Labor Party, right? And on the Palestinian side, they heard from their leader that Israel had been playing games with them, and America had been playing games with them, that they lowballed them, that they started off so low, that they weren't willing to have equal swaps for the rest of the land that Israel intended on keeping. So they were, all blaming Israel. And it's very interesting to see how each side thinks that it kind of made all the concessions in each negotiation, and the other side was not genuinely committed. And the problem is that each side has very different visions of what went on in the past agreements. And so there was such frustration that things weren't happening on the ground. You got the second intifada happening, which was far more violent than the first had been, right? So that practically every single week, sometimes multiple times a day, there were suicide bombings within the 67 borders of Israel, in malls and restaurants and buses, etc. And so over 1,000 Israelis died, mostly civilians, which if you look at the small Israeli population would be equivalent to about 100,000 Americans dying in weekly suicide bombings over a few months span, right? And then the Israeli side reacted, and often overreacted, to these attacks. They fired 1 million bullets in the first few days of the Second Intifada, thereby exacerbating it even more. And often when they were going after a suspect, other civilians would be killed, so that 3,000 to 5,000 Palestinians were killed in Israeli reactions, and at times overreactions to this, which means in terms of the American population, that would be about 150,000 people dying. So you basically get a situation between 2000 and 2005 that you have a deep cycle of violence where every single Israeli knows someone that has died in a suicide bombing, and every Palestinian knows someone who has died in Israeli reactions. Not only that, but the more right prime minister that is in power at this time in 2002, after kind of the worst suicide bombing, in which in a Passover dinner, 3 generations of families were killed in a hotel who were celebrating it, he says that's that, and he reoccupies parts of the West Bank that Israel had withdrawn from previously, which changes the game again. So you really have a horrible situation on the ground. And by 2005, Israel also builds the security barrier, wall, fence, whatever you want to call it, which puts a big decrease in suicide bombings, but also goes beyond the 67 borders, is not built on the 67 borders, and really infringes on Palestinian day-to-day life for people who are living on either side of that barrier, which is a real problem. It continues settlements. So violence continues, settlements continues, and I can talk to you more about why the settlements continue as well, because there are all kinds of political reasons in the Israeli system why that happens. So you have this huge period. Again, once again, in 2005, by the way, Arafat passes away. You have Abu Mazen, who becomes the leader, who's the leader today. And he says the Second Intifada didn't work. Basically, this kind of violence doesn't work. Israel has only reoccupied parts of the West Bank it had withdrawn from. We're not in any peace negotiations. We're actually losing some parts of world sympathy because of the tactics in a post-9/11 world. And he decides to turn to nonviolence, after 2005. And there's a lot of security cooperation with US help since 2005, and right now, despite the political stagnation in the peace process, there's fantastic security cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, where they share intelligence. They both have their own reasons for clamping down on Hamas, who's a rival of Fatah, etc. So now there is relative quiet in the territories, and in that sense, you get a new prime minister in Israel, right? You have less changeover on the Palestinian side, a lot of zigzagging on the Israeli side. Why? The Israeli side has a parliamentary system where there are over 20 political parties, and no single party can ever win a majority vote because it's split among so many parties. So each party that's elected has to scramble to get other parties in a coalition government. And it's unstable politically, because at any point, any party can say, I'm out of the coalition, the government can collapse, and there are new elections. So that's part of the reason you have such a rapid succession, which is frustrating on the Palestinian side, of different Israeli prime ministers who sometimes have different policies and outlooks towards this peace process. So you get Ehud Olmert elected, who again is much more genuine than Sharon is, and I can get into ideological and personality reasons, in trying to be serious about getting a political resolution to the conflict. There are a series of dozens of serious negotiations that happened in 2008 in which the parties come very close to reaching an agreement. So by the way, in 2001, there was a negotiation in Taba, and Clinton put up his own parameters, what's called the Clinton parameters, to try to bridge the gaps between the parties. And I'll just kind of walk you through the essentials of those parameters. And those parameters are that Israel wants to keep, let's say, around 6% of the West Bank, and I'll explain to you why. The Palestinian Authority, even in 2001, Abu Mazen said, you can keep 2%. Israel wants to keep 6%. So they're not that far apart in terms of the territory itself. And what would happen is there'd be a one-to-one land swap. Now, why does Israel want to keep a certain percentage? It's because right now, there's over 300,000 settlers on the West Bank, 500,000 if you include East Jerusalem and all the suburbs, et cetera. But the majority of those settlers live in 3 or 4 settlement blocks, which are like mini cities in the municipality of Jerusalem. And they're there for economic reasons. They're 10 minutes outside of Jerusalem. They're not that far away from Tel Aviv, and it's cheaper to live there. They're there for economic reasons, which means they're not there for religious reasons or anything like that. And so Israel says, well, if we can keep these 3 settlement blocks right outside of Jerusalem, let's say that they think is in 4% of the land or whatever, that means we won't have to move 300,000 people. We'll only have to move 70,000 people back into what would be considered the new borders of Israel. And that's their rationale. And Abu Mazen has made some compromises there over the years and has said so publicly that, yes, you can keep 2%, but I don't want you to keep 6%. So what Clinton did is said, okay, it's going to be between 94% and 98% of the West Bank with land swaps. Land swaps meaning that whatever it is, the 2% or 4% or 6% that Israel keeps, it has to give the exact quantity and quality of land within its 67 borders back to a Palestinian state. So it could include, since the Gaza Strip is so overcrowded and populated, sections of land near the Gaza Strip to alleviate that are within the 67 borders. It could include a highway connecting the West Bank to the Gaza Strip, which is about 30 miles. And there are lots of ideas what land would be conceded, and there is an agreement on swaps. Not only is there an agreement on swaps between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, there's now an agreement by the Arab League. Because every few years they reconfirm their Saudi 2002 plan as to what they would advocate. And as I told you initially, they said 67 borders. Now they say in the Arab League proposition peace proposal, 67 borders based on 67 borders with land swaps. And that's what that means. So they're actually, in terms of territory, it's doable, right? You know, between 2% and 6%. So that's what Clinton says. You guys are going to have to reach, you know, a compromise within this 4%, right? But the much harder issues are Jerusalem and refugees, because you can't, as neatly and easily, okay, are you saying I should wrap up? Okay, sorry. I'll try to in the next 5 minutes. You can't so easily make those trade-offs. It's not like land, you know, where you can easily divide it. So Clinton, I think, had a very good and creative, I'd love to get your you know, feedback, comments on it, but he had a very creative proposal. And he basically said which three previous Israeli governments and Abu Mazen have essentially agreed to. And the trade-off is this, right? That the issue of refugees is important to both. The issue of Jerusalem is important to both. But what's most important to each? Can we clarify that and make a trade-off? And what Clinton said is actually Israel is most interested in trying to retain a democracy with a Jewish majority. And in that sense, what it's most concerned about is not having free refugee flow back into the state. So what it said, the Clinton parameters say, is that Israel, the Palestinians will compromise on refugees to Israel, meaning there'll be a right of return to Palestinians to the new Palestinian state that's created, but they won't fully implement the right of return back to Israel. Right, so that basically Israel can curtail, and now they're haggling over numbers. Israel said maybe 40,000 can return, maybe the Palestinian Authority wants 200,000 to return, but the Palestinian Authority in previous negotiations in 2001 and 2008 has said we will curb the implementation of the right of return. So we concede to you that most Palestinians are not going to return to pre-1967 Israel. By the way, surveys show most Palestinians wouldn't want to return, so it's an issue of principle. And on the other side, Israel has to concede most of East Jerusalem to a Palestinian state. So Palestine is going to have a very small state. It's not going to get completely what it wants of refugees, but it's going to have the symbolism of Al-Quds, or East Jerusalem, and the mosques in terms of Palestinian state, where Muslims from all over the world will be coming to the Palestinian state when they come to these mosques. And that's the trade-off that they've essentially agreed to. And that's why I'm saying that they actually have made a lot of progress, and that pretty much, I think, and we'll see what happens, this is going to be the framework, you know, base 67 with swaps, whether it's 2%, 4%, 5%, and a trade-off between Israel conceding most of East Jerusalem and the Palestinians conceding implementation of the right of return of refugees to Israel. And so that's a lot of what they're negotiating today. And Abu Mazen, one reason why you didn't have negotiations for 3 years is Abu Mazen knew that Netanyahu said, I don't want to make any concessions on Jerusalem, even though Olmert was willing to, even though Barak was willing to, Netanyahu said he wasn't willing to. So he thought there's no point in negotiating, in addition to the settlement issue. But that was the primary concern. Interesting today, it'd be interesting to see if Netanyahu indeed will make some compromises on Jerusalem. You had efforts just this past week in the Israeli legislature to say we're going to need a majority of 80 out of 120 Knesset members to make any concessions, so approve any concessions on Jerusalem. And Netanyahu was opposing that new law that's being put forth in the legislature, which would make it harder to make concessions on Jerusalem. So perhaps that gives some hope that he might be willing to make concessions on Jerusalem, which I think is what it would take to reach a peaceful agreement. I'm so sorry that I've gone a little bit over, and I welcome any questions, critiques, comments.
I'm going to ask for maybe 1 or 2 questions now, and then After I talk, which will be, I promise, no more than about 8 minutes, you'll be invited to ask for ask more questions, if that's all right. Does anybody have any questions at the moment for Professor Aronoff? Besides you.
I want students first, right?
Please go ahead, Professor St. Clair.
You mentioned the Arab League making the offer. I'm assuming you're talking about I think they made one in 2002.
Right, but they've reaffirmed it in several Arab League
Basically,
meetings
all
since
the Arab countries, I think, unanimously said they
Right.
would make peace with Israel.
Not
They
only
went back
Arab,
to the
but
19th.
Muslim majority countries too have added to that, yeah.
Okay, and then again in 2006, and then the last time that offer was made?
It was made this past year with a new concession, as I said, in terms of land swaps. Yeah, that was this past year.
2012 or 2013?
I should know. It's either the end of 2012 or the beginning of 2013. Yeah. Which is a really pragmatic, significant move. Yeah.
Professor Voroshik.
Thank you, Professor DeVivo. No, I'm speechless. But, I hear many times that a resolution of Israeli-Palestinian conflict is resolution for political stability and peace. And I hear it from countries such as Iran. I hear it from terrorist organizations / political parties / charity organizations / social help organizations such as Hezbollah and Hamas. To what degree is that true in your view, and to what degree are these organizations and countries just pursuing their other parts of political agenda?
To what extent do they reject the two-state solution? Is that what you're asking? Or?
I'm asking to what extent do they basically use the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as justification for their political agenda?
Yeah.
To what degree is this legitimate concern?
Yeah.
Is it true in other ways that a resolution of Israeli-Palestinian conflict is really going to bring stability and peace in the regions?
Yeah, I don't think, as we can see from the upheavals around the Middle East in the last couple of years and civil wars, et cetera, and rivalries between Shiites and Sunnis, that resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is going to bring peace to the region at all, because many of the conflicts and wars going on have nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So that's not the case. That being said, it's a very important conflict to resolve, not only for the people themselves, but Obama has now said it's a vital security interest of the United States, and several American administrations keep beefing up how important it is. Of course, Obama at the UN said there are two things I want to do diplomatically in my administration, and then that's getting a deal with Iran and getting an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal, right? And those were the very first leaders he called. So I don't think it's going to solve all the problems in the Middle East, but it's certainly a very important conflict to solve, not only for the people involved themselves, but in Israel's case, it will allow it to establish normal relations with many other states in the region and be more integrated into the region. And it is a very emotive thing that so many people in the Middle East care about and empathize with the suffering of the Palestinians and so forth. And a vast majority of it, I think, is legitimately genuine for legitimate reasons. Of course, their state-controlled media often capitalize that and on that and use that to distract from domestic problems, as you say. Now, with Hamas, I think they are genuinely interested, obviously, since they represent Palestinians. With Hezbollah, they may be using it to some extent, and Iran as well, for political reasons. Iran to mobilize support for its leadership in the region. And the new leader, Rouhani, seems to have put out signals that Iran will no longer engage in the weekly rhetoric it had under Ahmadinejad of destroying Israel or wiping Israel out, but rather that it might be willing to accept Israel in the region under certain conditions if the conflict was resolved. So there is some hope with a new Iranian leadership that might change.
Thank you. I think I should have posed the question a little bit more precisely. I was actually going to ask whether it would alleviate the problem of extremist Islamic terrorism. That's what.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would getting an Israeli-Palestinian agreement alleviate?
Yes.
I think it would. I don't think it would eliminate it. Certainly on the part of Hamas and Hezbollah, it would. It wouldn't eliminate it because you're always going to have factions of Hamas that want, that just, reject a two-state solution. You have now kind of Al-Qaeda-like cells in the Gaza Strip and in the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. So you're never going to get everyone on board in this complicated world, but I do think it would lead to a moderation on the part of Hamas and Hezbollah. Potentially, it would they would get less mileage out of continuing to be a rejectionist state once the Arab League, in addition to the UN and the US and Russia and the EU, were putting their mantle of legitimacy on this. So I think it would certainly weaken them. And both parties have already been weakened in the last 2 years. Hezbollah, of course, propping up the Assad regime, sending several thousand of its own troops into Syria, has really lost a lot of legitimacy in the region. Yeah. But it's not going to stop all terror groups, because of course those Al-Qaeda groups in Syria have nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I don't think that would change. Yeah.
Professor Aronoff,
Yeah.
thank you so very much for enlightening.
Thank you.
Let's have a hand for Professor Aronoff. Isn't she great? I'll tell you, I know now why my daughter thought that she was her favorite professor. My goodness.
But I'm sorry I didn't leave more time for questions. I could talk a whole semester about this subject. But I welcome you. I'll stay as long as you guys want me to if you have any questions.
I'll talk for maybe about 8 minutes, and I beg you to please ask her questions after my epilogue, if you will. And we're very, very fortunate to have Professor Aronoff here, and I'm sure that you can understand why she is the recipient of Teaching Excellence Awards. I did this before, didn't I? Is this good? Are we good? In conclusion, I will offer some concluding remarks. Last week, I was asked to provide a statement concerning the importance of celebrating UN Day, which officially is 24 October. I reflected on this and noted that in the aftermath of World War II, the United Nations was established to reduce the impact of war, promote diplomacy to resolve international disputes, facilitate development, and advance human rights. Reflecting over the course of the past 68 years, especially in light of the many wars, atrocities, and injustices across the globe that have occurred since the UN's creation, it is fair to criticize this international organization for not often enough achieving its goals. By the same token, the UN's mission is formidable. And one must acknowledge that despite its failings, there have been many accomplishments. Certainly, pursuit of its ideals is an imperative, and commemorating the founding of this international forum compels all of us living in the United States to recognize that concomitant with the privileges of freedom and opportunity is the responsibility of global citizenship. I'm reminded of John F. Kennedy's inaugural address on a snowy day in January 1961, in which he challenged Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. I was just a child, but I vividly recall how this mantra was embraced and frequently broadcast on television, promoting service in the Peace Corps and volunteers in service to America, the antecedent of today's AmeriCorps. The threat of nuclear holocaust was real as the US and the Soviet Union competed across the globe for influence in fighting a Cold War that did not end until 1989. It is significant that those of us born in the 20 years following the end of the Second World War have spent more than half our lives under the shadow of the Cold War. Arguably, It was this conflict, often carried out as military escalations and civil wars from Angola to Vietnam and beyond, that forced American college and university students to recognize the importance of learning about the world. Certainly, the conscription of young men into military service played a role here, but the point to be made is that analytical study of the social sciences proved to be vital in the curricula of all credible higher education institutions in the United States. For it was a given that one of the principal reasons to enroll students in colleges was for the development of an educated public citizenry, capable of critical thinking and decision-making for the betterment of society. Students launched demonstrations to protest U.S. involvement in Vietnam, playing a role in the election and re-election of a Republican president that moved toward the withdrawal of American troops. Students also protested against apartheid, creating quasi-shanty towns on college campuses and pressing for their institutions' divestment of funds intended for South Africa. In fact, in a number of public lectures, Archbishop Desmond Tutu has claimed that these protests were a very important part in the process of ending apartheid. And he has time and again expressed thanks to American college students for playing here a significant role. Regardless, throughout this era, government funding for education overall was substantial. For example, the National Defense Education Act supported academic programs in geography, area studies, and foreign languages. And NASA sponsored the Appalachian Community Service Network, a broadcast television network that provided educational programs devoted to nature, science, history, medicine, and current events. Incidentally, this network has since been privatized and became TLC, now apparently very well known for its most popular show, which attracts more than 3 million viewers, Here Comes Honey Boo Boo. In terms of public higher education, state government funding made up the lion's share of costs, although the proportion of state funding had decreased by 1987. States then still contributed an average of 77% toward the average annual cost for each student's attendance. Today, although the cost of attendance remains the same, about $11,000, when adjusting for inflation, states contribute an average of only 53% per student. Thus, as state support for higher education has decreased by almost half, while the cost borne by individual students has doubled, the value of a college education has been called into question, and full-time students now spend about 1/3 less time on their studies today than was spent by students 50 years ago. It's little wonder that half of prospective employers surveyed claimed difficulty in finding qualified college graduates to hire. In another recent survey in which a response to the question, what is the most important reason people should go to college, 54% of college leaders assert that critical thinking and becoming an informed citizen in a global society are most important. In contrast, only 18% of the public respond similarly. Obviously, a disconnect exists, for the public does not appear to realize the employability of critically thinking global citizens and their contributions to the global economy and to themselves. Nor do academic institutions seem to be effective in delivering this message. Consequently, government funding for education has been reduced as legislators in decision-making roles have been quick to dismiss the overall value of higher education. Moreover, as students' families have been tasked with picking up more and more of the tab for their education, economic materialism has emerged as a predominant value. In 1970, 70% of students argued that developing a meaningful philosophy of life was an essential reason for them to enter college, and only a minority considered becoming very well off financially as essential. By the end of the 20th century, the tables were turned. 74% asserted that financial affluence was essential, and only a minority claimed that a meaningful philosophy of life was important. A consumer mentality among students emerged and burgeoned as government contributions to higher education declined. Students increasingly have sought not an education per se, but a credential to secure a well-paying job, not necessarily being cognizant that although employers demand credentials, they also seek in their prospective employees communication skills beyond text messaging, critical thinking for problem solving, and in this era of globalization, some understanding of the increasing interconnectedness of people and places through converging processes of economic, political, and cultural change. Definitely, government funds at all levels are an essentiality for public higher education to maintain integrity and provide students with what they need and what society needs, which might be a bit different than what students and the public think they want. Clearly, when a toddler in a tiara has become more important than educational programming, some reassessment of priorities is in order if the U.S. wishes to maintain a position of prominence in a world marked by globalization and supporting the kind of education that is devoted to preparing knowledgeable global citizens tasked with addressing problems and coming up with viable solutions is an imperative. Given that, it might be worthwhile to re-examine part of President Kennedy's inaugural address that isn't so well known. Now the trumpet summons us again, not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need, not as a call to battle, though embattled we are, but a call to bear the burden of a lone twilight struggle year in and year out, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, a struggle against the common enemies of man, tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. Can we forge against these enemies a grand and global alliance, north and south, east and west, that we can assure a more fruitful life for all mankind? Will you join in that historic effort? As we reflect on this plea, we celebrate the founding of the United Nations, accepting its imperfections as an unfortunate reality, but also recognizing its ideals. We ponder the talks today by Professors Yatcher and Aronoff, and the discussion carried out by Professors Varusic, St. Clair, and Restra, realizing that we have gained some understanding as we hope the long journey we are on will take us towards stability and prosperity across the globe. In 1961, President Kennedy asked Americans to bear a burden against tyranny, poverty, disease, and war, to assure a more fruitful life for all mankind. Here, as I leave you, I ask you to consider taking on the challenge of responsible global citizenship, and I echo the President's plea. Will you join in that historic effort? Will you join in that historic effort? Thank you and good night. And please feel free to ask questions to Professor Aronoff, if you would.